Welcome back, everybody, to a special holiday edition of the Hidden History Happy Hour. My pal Alex Dean is out on festive assignment of some sort, but not to worry, because we have the world's most famous urban warfare expert, my friend, my new friend on X Spaces, John Spencer. John, how are you, my friend?
I'm great, brother. Thanks for having me. Excited.
Thanks for coming. I have to say, John, that you are my second favorite John Spencer. I'm sorry to say.
I do enjoy that. I mean, the series was amazing, right? The famous actor John Spencer. If you
The
Google,
West Wing.
yeah,
Yeah.
West
Yeah.
Wing.
Yeah, so he unfortunately John Spencer, the actor, will be my favorite, but also you cheated on me with another law of armed conflict lawyer, so that's an issue. Have to work out at some point. But today is not about that. Today is about urban warfare, and it's especially about the power and the importance of storytelling in war and to soldiers. So everybody, John Spencer is an award-winning scholar, professor, author, combat veteran, national security and military analyst, an internationally recognized expert and advisor on urban warfare, military strategy, tactics, and other related topics. John served as an advisor to the top four-star general and other senior leaders in the U.S. Army as part of a strategic research groups from the Pentagon to where he teaches now the United States Military Academy. John is currently the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point and co-director of the Urban Warfare Project, and importantly, the Urban Warfare Project podcast, which will be in the show notes. I urge you to check it out. It starts with some cool helicopter noises. I don't know. I still like our oldie-timey theme song, but it's a great podcast. And John is now world famous. Anyone who has a television or is in the descended into the bowels of X spaces like John and I have knows who John is. John, let me tell our new viewers and listeners who came over, followed us over from X Spaces, who might not have seen the show before, what we're doing here. So in this show, the Hidden History Happy Hour, we tell obscure stories from history based on these two books, Lessons from History by my co-author, Alex Dean, co-host Alex Dean, and the cleverly titled, you can't imagine, John, how much money they spent coming up with this, More Lessons from History by Alex Dean. And so we talk about it. We drink, if we're drinkers, we drink what our characters might have been drinking, and we discuss the relevance to current events. So I'm going to tell one of Alex's stories in a minute. John doesn't know what this story is, but it directly relates to urban warfare. But first, John, tell us what you're up to. Where can people find you? What are your books? Tell us about you. And by the way, cheers, everybody.
Cheers, brother. So I'm continuing my research. As you said, I work for a research center. So I'm primarily a research professor, as I mean, I conduct research and then create products which other people can use to teach or inform their own education. Self-education is really big. So I travel the world to combat zones now in my retirement, like you getting into trouble sometimes, but doing research on modern wars, specifically the urban aspect of that. My book came out last year, one of my books, Understanding Urban Warfare. I tried to create that clever title as well. What is it about? It's about you understanding, you, the reader, urban warfare. And when the Ukraine-Russia war kicked off in February 2022, I had a unique situation, which thrust me into kind of a media light, which I hadn't done before. But luckily, I've done over a decade of research, so hopefully I know what I'm talking about a little bit. And then I started doing this analyst thing, which is almost on top of what I do. I do research. I create products for other people to learn from.
Yeah, well, it's great. And you've helped educate me and tens of thousands of other people about urban warfare on X, formerly known as Twitter Spaces, and elsewhere. And guys, this is how famous John is, okay? There's actually a thing. If you go into an X space and John is somewhere in the audience and they want John to come up and talk, they simply say urban warfare 3 times, and much like the genie, John pops up. And I'm aspiring to that with the law of war. That's what I'm hoping for myself.
Unfortunately, that went in the wrong direction at first, where they said all we have to do is rub the genie and he comes up. Like, let's rub the bottle.
People at home, don't type rub the genie into your browser. You don't want to search for that. It's not going to end well for you. Hey, for those of you who are just joining us from other spaces and other places, please go subscribe to our podcast everywhere you get your podcasts. Please rate us a good rating. If you don't like the show, don't rate us at all. And follow us and tell your friends. So, John, I'm going to tell a story from More Lessons from History, and then we'll talk about the urban warfare implications of it. And I want to see how long it takes for you to understand what the story is, probably right away when I say the names of the countries. But the story is called, and I'm using for the first time the Hidden History Happy Hour whiteboard. For those who can see, Release the Bees. This is our story for today, Release the Bees. And I'm going to do it as Alex Dean, my co-host, would, old school, reading right from the book. It is short, don't worry. And you will probably correct me on the pronunciations of these two warring parties here, okay? The Romans were fond of fighting wars against Mithridates of Pontius. Did I say that right? Mithridates of Pontius. That's how I'm saying it. Apologies to the Pontians, many are still around. And spoiler alert, they got their man and his empire in the end. But Mithridates and his allies certainly made Rome work for the win. In the longest and the last of the Mithridatic Wars, 73 to 63 BC, the Romans laid siege to, sorry, I'm going to butcher this one too, probably, Themyscira. So that sounds right to me, Themyscira. Themyscira was a tough nut to crack, and after other measures had failed, the Romans, seemingly unable to go over walls of the city, decided to go under them. Led by Lucullus, beloved by Rome as much for his unbelievable amount of booty with which he returned from his campaigns as for the victories he notched up for them, the Roman army dug a huge and deep network of tunnels to both undermine the great walls of the city and potentially allow them to penetrate it from within without having to scale the walls. You know the story, John?
I know of many stories like it. That one specifically isn't ringing a bell. Yeah.
Oh, great. Excellent. This is going to be good. Realizing Lucullus's plan, the plucky Themyscrians dug tunnels of their own, successfully designed and implemented to interact with those of the Romans. And then they unleashed all manner of wild animals from the city, forcing them down the tunnels toward Lucullus's men. Not just angry dogs and such either. These creatures were so varied as to include at one end of the size spectrum, swarms of bees, and at the other end of the spectrum, enormous bears. Said animals, recorded in the annals of history, duly attacked the Romans in the tunnels. Now, it's true that in the end, the Themyscirians lost, and lost so hard that their city was ground into dust so thoroughly that debate continues to this day about where it was or was not precisely located. But that is hardly the point. First, we mark the ingenuity of the defenders in stopping at nothing in what they would throw at the Romans. Unleash the bees, haha, fight them, Romans. Secondly, we have to imagine the feeling of the attackers. You're on your umpteenth campaign against the Pontic mob. You've fought battles. You've dug the tunnels you've been ordered to dig. It's hot. You're tired. You've got about 100 bee stings on you in an age with no EpiPens and a relatively limited understanding of anaphylaxis. And wait, what's this? Oh, yes, of course. It is an angry bear coming at me down the tunnel. But they still won. Now, it's too well-known a lesson to dwell on, really. But given that they overcame this too, we shall note that in their prime, those Roman legions really did know what they were about.
As somebody who has been attacked in the face by African killer bees, I relate to that story.
Wow. Where did this occur? In Texas or somewhere?
No, Panama, my first duty station.
Oh, no.
Yeah, in the jungles of Panama on land navigation. It wasn't fun. No.
When I was in the agency, we got just enough paramilitary training to know that if we ever needed it, we could call the real experts. That was the entire point of the 12 weeks. We did a little bit of land navigation, John. And I will tell I don't think I've told this story before on our podcast, but they decided in their infinite wisdom I was 24 or something. They decided in their infinite wisdom to make me the notional platoon commander for our field exercise. And our field exercise basically consisted of, I think it was 80 hours of being chased around in the freezing cold somewhere in Virginia by a bunch of National Guardsmen. And we had to do land navigation, and every night you had to hit a certain point. So you couldn't just hide. You had to march around all the time. And I knew I was terrible at this. It would have been a complete disaster. But I had a guy in my platoon who had just retired as an Army Ranger. So, and he had all the gear, all he snuck in his good compass as opposed to the World War II surplus crap they gave us. So I appointed him my XO. And I said to him, and we're still close friends to this day, I said, all you need to do is walk 3 feet behind me, look at the map, and whisper in my ear the maneuver commands. And we did, and we hit all our objectives, and we survived until when we were supposed to get caught and interrogated. And we got done with the 3 days of interrogation training. And my instructor came up to me in the bar afterwards on the base, and he said, Cunningham, we know what you did. And of course, I had already had enough training at this point to not say anything because I didn't know what they knew or didn't know, right? And he says, we know that you picked Lex as your lieutenant because you weren't able to do the land navigation. And it's pregnant pause. And he says, and we really respect the ingenuity and the knowledge of your own failings that you did. And that showed leadership. Another pregnant pause. He says, but if you were an undercover operator overseas, it is often highly valuable to appear to be lost. It's not so valuable to actually be lost. So this is why I became an analyst. That's nice. That's my land nav story. So John, I don't know if you're ready to talk about this, but I know that you've recently made a very informative trip to the Ukraine. And I know you probably want to hold your key findings for your publications, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I just got back, I think it's going on 2.5, if not 3 weeks ago, from my 4th research trip. So I've made 4 trips into Ukraine since the full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022. I was there actually shortly after the Russians were defeated, and I can qualify that with the definition, defeated on April of 2022 and pulled out of the major capital area in Kyiv and all the other cities in in Western Ukraine. Yeah. So I was on the ground in May, late May of 2022. But my last trip, I'm an urban warfare guy. I'm a one-trick pony. So even my research is focused on significant urban battles, which is really interesting. Right now, my focus in the trip that I just took is on the Battle of Mariupol, which has a very, we were going to talk about storytelling, a very unique story.
Yeah.
That can be traced back to like Thermopylae and Alamo and all these other ones that, with different endings and different meanings, but where a story of a war or a battle can become tied to national identity. Remember the Alamo, remember Mariupol. So right now, my last trip that I just took was interviewing veterans of that battle and some stories that are so crazy that they're almost unbelievable. Like the helicopter resupplies that were sent into Mariupol, which is crazy. It's almost so crazy. It's like the Band of Brothers scene, because people like to relate to movies.
Yeah.
Where the captain, runs through the Russians or through the Germans to get to where he's going to communicate with the other, and then runs back. Well, the Ukrainians did a helicopter resupply which was that crazy, and I got to talk to a helicopter pilot. So that was the research, and it'll become a story in and of itself on top of the report on the Battle of Mariupol.
And this will be turned into a book, a mini series. What are you doing with it?
Yeah, so my next book, I write case studies, right? Which is like you just read. People have ideals of what happened during certain battles. Like for me, in my world, it's Stalingrad, Fallujah, all these terms that people use to kind of do a shortcut on analysts or analysis. So first and foremost, most like the Battle of Kyiv, the Battle of Mariupol will be a case study. But I have collected so many stories on both that you could turn it into a book, but you only have so much time in the day. I am paid for certain things. So initially there'll be case studies published at the Modern War Institute. The case studies themselves, and we're up to like 8 or 9 right now in work, will be an anthology of case studies of battles which people use all the time and don't really know what they're talking about.
So who was the most interesting / heroic character that you met in your most recent trip?
So the helicopter pilot, it was just
talk about that, the helicopter.
So if people don't know, and during this Battle of Mariupol, which was an 80-day battle, were about 3,000 defenders of the city who were there when the Russians attacked, held the city. They fell back. They actually already planned to a steel factory, which had some bunkers underneath it. And they held this for 80 plus days. But there was a point where they were out of ammo, getting ready to collapse. And the head of the Ukrainian Directorate of Intelligence organized a helicopter resupply, which is pretty insane in general. I mean, there were 20,000 Russians surrounding the city and
There's no air superiority either, right?
yeah, no, like
Yeah.
complete Russians had complete control of the area, had complete air defense of the area, and somehow they still said, I think we can do it. And they brought together some pilots, which I thought would be like these special forces, 160th SOAR for the US military pilots to do this amazing helicopter thing. And that's so I got to interview one of the helicopter pilots who did this
Oh
resupply.
my goodness.
And he wasn't one of those. He was a guy who had flown as a civilian and had done some time in the military back during the Yugoslav war, like so long ago, had not flown under knives, nothing. And then when the full scale invasion, he volunteered to return to service and was help flying helicopters. So he wasn't told the plan because that's what you do. Move to
Operational security, yeah.
operational security, move to a point, and gets told like he gets to where he's going, and he's told to fly to this location. Gets off, some intelligence people said, "Hey, you're flying into Mariupol." He's like, "Okay, let's do it." They load his helicopter up with hundreds of pounds of medical supplies and ammo, and that's it. And then they said, you'll be prepared to fly to Mariupol. Here will be the route. And they started briefing him on the route. And then at one point they come and say, here's another 120 kilos, like over 200 pounds of ammo and medical equipment you want to take. But as a helicopter pilot, like, well, that's not possible. So they took off the guns of the.
Oh my goodness.
They unhooked the guns of this helicopter. So an Mi-8, so just an old Soviet, like not no fancy Apache or anything, and loaded it down. They fly Napa the Earth. So that's pretty crazy. The fact that he hadn't had training.
Yeah, so this is for people that don't know. That's when you fly, as I understand it, barely off the ground and you're following the contours of the ground.
That's right, trying to stay below radar, in which somebody would pick up a helicopter. So they fly basically an hour and a half with 40 minutes of it in darkness, and then they get to a line. So he's flying under night vision goggles, and they hit the Azov Sea, and he's flying so low that he's hitting some of the skids are hitting the water. That's how low they're flying, deathly afraid of what the Russian control. And they're come up over the sea, and they know there's power lines, so they have to pop up over these power lines, come down violently, and land in this factory that these defenders. The whole story is just insane. And then they fly out. So they actually download all the ammo, which are like Stingers, javelins, and critical ammo, and they load critically wounded. Well, Ukraine does 7 of these flights, and they never use the same pilot. So each time they use pilots who had no idea where they were going, had no training in the flight path, and were just briefed for operational security reasons when they got there. You're going to fly this mission with the Russians knowing that it happened once.
Yeah.
But they did it 7 times, lost 3 helicopters. But it's just this epic story that'll go down in history. And I got almost like an exclusive because some of these stories have been told, but for different audiences.
Yeah.
It was insane.
Wow, it's amazing. So there were 7 different one-time pilots that did this.
7 sorties of 16 helicopters. So yeah, 16 different pilots. There's one flight engineer who did it twice, and he got shot down and was killed.
Wow. On the second one, obviously. And so, but the rest got in and out without being captured or killed?
That's right. They dropped all payloads. They lost, everybody's payload got dropped. They lost a total of 3 helicopters of the 16 helicopters, the 7 sorties of 2 helicopters, which is really interesting. He said that, as a military guy, like, we were told this isn't one mission with 2 helicopters. It's 2 helicopters with 2 missions. So if the other one goes down, you keep driving on. It has nothing to do with your mission. And it was just a one guy on the other end saying, basically radioing, yeah, it looks good. Come on in. Just everything about it as a military guy, was just amazing. And the guy told it with such clarity. I can't wait to release that story.
Do you feel like if the pilots that they approached were professional military pilots, they would have thought it was so crazy they wouldn't have wanted to do it? Or is it just like, why didn't they use military pilots, I guess is the question.
I mean, technically they were military. I just think the Ukrainian military had gone through such big reforms that they didn't have that level of special forces trained. If you
Yeah.
understand who our special operator and helicopter pilots are, I mean, that's decades of experience and training and tryouts for the unit, all this stuff. So I don't think they had them.
Yeah, understood. Yeah. All right. Well, look, we could hear these stories all day, and hopefully you'll come back. But I did want to just talk to you about, as both as someone who served in combat and as a historian, what do you think the impact of both case studies, the kind of stuff you do, but also just novels and movies and popular entertainment about warfare? What is the value of that to the warfighter?
I mean, I think it's immense. So one, I'm not a historian. Actually, the partner who I'm kind of like you, I partner with smart people. The guy who I write my case studies with is an actual historian. I get yelled at for butchering history all the time. I'm more of a I'm a researcher, but I am also such a advocate of storytelling because I understand as a young soldier when I joined the military, like you join a military, it doesn't matter which one, with preconceptions that were formed through books, through movies, through compelling stories about war. It shapes society's views of what war should or shouldn't be, what the veteran experience is. It shapes so much of human civilizations that people don't acknowledge it. In whether it's oral history or in the movies. I'm actually headed to a play in New York City, which I know, Bryan, you're going to see it, which is another medium to tell a story. So my case studies.
Well, let me just interrupt you, John. So John's being too modest on two fronts. One, I think he actually is at least an excellent amateur historian, if not a professional one. And two, what he left out about this play in New York called War Words is one of the characters is based on him. And I'm going to go see this next week. But talk about the play for a second, and then let's come back to the point.
Sure. So the play is another, basically, my friend Michelle Brooks wrote a play about war stories, the stories of modern veterans, because she said, I didn't know anything about the wars. And then she started doing interviews, and I just happened to be through a close connection with her husband, Max Brooks, who's a famous storyteller, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Never read World War Z, the book. You should read it. It's amazing. And what's crazy, as a historian, you'll appreciate that Max Brooks, her husband, is actually a military history buff. Everything in World War Z about zombies actually happened in history. It's
amazing.
It's human responses to crisis, like
Yeah.
COVID or something like that. Like people wouldn't do that. Like no, and he just put a zombie in there as the protagonist. But
Yeah.
but she wrote this play using veteran stories, and one of them, humbly, is my story about my identity as a soldier and my experiences in combat. So it's really humbling to do it. But
Well, I'll be taking a lot of Kleenex into the theater, John. I'm a big softie. I'm sure I'll be tearing up a little bit.
yeah, I get goosebumps just watching the sizzle reel to War Words. Having I saw a virtual reading of it during COVID because of COVID, but I've never seen it in person.
Ah, no kidding.
And they said I had to wear, basically I couldn't let the cast know I was there or it might mess up their performance. I'm like, I'm just, I'm not that.
So
that,
have you been yet, or you haven't been?
First
Oh, no.
person seeing it. And I really hope it grows. You know how play has to grow and make it through all the transitions.
Well, yeah, and for all of our audience, I will probably have seen it by the time this actually comes out, so I'll report on it afterwards. But not only is it gotten amazing reviews, but also it's very cheap for a New York play. It's I'm in the front row, John. I'll get spit on, by the actors accidentally, and $45.
Yeah,
which is like a fifth of most Broadway tickets.
Yeah. And I was actually that front row too, like A row. And they're like, oh no, you can't be there. They'll see you. I'm like, I'm not that, but if somebody was researching a role, right? Like the guy who's playing me clearly would recognize me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But back to the case studies.
Yeah.
I think it's important. So one of the reasons as an amateur historian or somebody, as I studied over a decade of urban battles, urban warfare history, from Carthage to today, people use stories about battles without actually knowing what happened there. Like literally, they're just told through oral histories or whatever that this is what happened. So I thought it was important because I did the same thing. I thought this or that happened because I had heard it in a story. So I've gone back now into case studies from Stalingrad up till Mawari 2017 saying, look, here's what happened. These were the size of both sides. Here's the number of deaths. So to help inform people when they use them as kind of these in their storytelling and presenting ideals.
And would you say that stories affect people not only when they decide to go into the military, but also while you're fighting? I mean, did you have occasions, I don't want to get too personal, but did you have occasions when you were actually in a combat situation and you thought to yourself, boy, this happened in Saving Private Ryan, or anything like that?
100%. If you read my first book, Connected Soldiers, it is almost like not self-actualization, but you're achieving something you had in your mind, or you hit a cognitive dissonance where you thought there was, because of the movies and the books, you thought there was a romance to it, and you, like the sucky part isn't in the movie.
Yeah.
Although it's there, right? Like in Band of Brothers, which is one of the greatest series ever produced.
Yes, it is.
But the story of the greatest generation, right? For an American, that's very tangible as you relate your experience to that framework. So when I jumped into combat in 2003, like, well, I'm jumping into combat like these stories of all the greatest generation and D-Day and all these things. So absolutely, that's a huge part of serving in the military. For every generation that goes in, they want to relate it to something. But whereas a big problem, Brian, is when somebody joins the military and it's nothing like they thought.
Yeah.
Which happened, unfortunately, like with counterinsurgency, where I had to talk to my soldiers. I'm like you're not here to kill. You're not here to fight in these big gun battles that you've seen on TV. Like, we're here to achieve stability so that this can continue and we can achieve our national interests.
Yeah. So I've mentioned this before in various contexts, but one of my clients, and actually my co-host Alex Dean also works with them, is Palestra Technologies. And they're, as you know, very, very deeply deployed in Ukraine. The war crimes prosecutor there recently said in Time magazine that they're the engine along with Microsoft. And I only mention it because our experience was they started the company in 2004. And part of the reason was post 9/11 attacks, many, many, many young people were going into the Central Intelligence Agency, into the FBI, into special operations on the analytical side, and thought they were going to have the same tools that Jack Ryan has in the books, or that Kiefer Sutherland has in 24. And they get in there, I'm slightly exaggerating, but basically they're like Wang computers with a box this big and a little green screen this big. And so part of what the company did is just built a lot of really cool interfaces so humans could interact with it in the way they thought the government was already doing.
Yeah, it's if you really, and I've seen, actually, there's a paper about a CA guy who was trying to use storytelling to maintain institutional knowledge through storytelling.
Yeah.
So tangible to the human experience that I think we actually go off course when we try to get away from it. Like military doctrine, which is the bane of my existence because it reads like stereo instructions when humans don't learn that way, right? So storytelling is oral, but it's also in the way that even written information is. You have to tell a story so it will stick in the mind, and it can be part of self-identity, like you said, like what you think about something. But I think we get away from the storytelling to our detriment.
Well, I'm going to give you a heads up, John. We're going to let you go soon, but I'm going to ask you to recommend a couple of books and or movies that you think most accurately depict warfare. So that's just a heads up. Now I'm going to talk a little bit and say that not that this is Brian's book club, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the stories that influenced me in terms of what's happening with the current conflict. And the first one is this one right here, War and Remembrance by Herman Wouk. I don't know if have you ever read this book, John? So it's obviously a massive novel. It's 800 pages about the Holocaust and about World War II. And it's written as a novel, but it's meticulously researched and footnoted. And I read this book when I was about 9 years old. And it talks...
Reading a 900-page book at 9 years.
Well, I probably read it between age 9 and 11 or something like that. But I just found it in my parents' basement, and it very graphically and unflinchingly depicts the Holocaust and Auschwitz and one of the characters and everything that happens there. And I read this book as a kid, and I didn't believe it was a real thing. I thought, oh, the human beings couldn't possibly do that. This is too horrible. So anyway, War and Remembrance, I recommend for World War II. for Israel, Hamas specifically, I'll recommend another novel by Herman Wouk, same guy, called The Hope, which is a really interesting, at least for the first 100 pages, fictional but very well researched recreation of Israel in its founding days. And then finally, James A. Michener's The Source, which is much more of a 2,500-year history of Israel and the Middle East, but told in a narrative format. And I specifically mentioned Michener, John, because James Michener taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop, of which I am a graduate. And I do a lot of writing myself, fiction and otherwise. And I'm always thinking about James Michener, because James Michener would research his books for like 10 years, which is great. But then he would tell you every single word of his 10 years of research he did in the book. So I lean a little bit more towards brevity, but that's just me. What if our listeners and viewers were going to read one book about urban warfare besides yours, which we're going to put in the show notes, what would it be?
About urban warfare in general,
or just about warfare, either way, because we're going to make him read your book about urban warfare.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sebastian Junger's book War is an amazing version. No True Glory by Bing West, I'm a great fan of his work about the battles of Fallujah. It's almost like you asking me to pick my best kid.
Yeah.
Hue 1968, which is actually a recent book to come out about the Battle of Hue during the Vietnam War. Very, very good, very detailed, but also includes those human stories, which make the story come alive in your mind. And I actually highly recommend World War Z. And the reason that I made the connection with that author is because there's a scene in it called the Battle of Yonkers in it, which amazingly is so close to the actual experience of combat for the soldier versus the complexity of it. And of course, anything Stephen Ambrose writes is worth the read.
Who wrote Band of Brothers, as well as many, many other things. Well, I'm definitely going to go read World War Z, and I will rewatch Band of Brothers, which is not only, according to the experts, quite accurate, but it's immensely entertaining. Yes. And you'll see a lot of people in this movie who are big stars now, who are kind of just coming, and it's not a movie, it's a TV series, but who are just coming up in those days. So, John, I know you probably have to run off and do CNN or cheat on me with one of your other lawyer friends. So I'm just going to ask you one more question.
Okay.
Favorite Christmas movie?
The Christmas Story. Come on, man.
Christmas Story?
Yeah. You're gonna shoot your eye out.
You're going to shoot your eye out. And when the guy gets his tongue stuck on the outside the pole, the freezing pole.
It's a classic.
Okay. I gotta ask you one more question. Do you believe Die Hard is a Christmas movie?
I do, of course. Especially Die Hard 1. I mean, the rest are kind of downhill, but yeah, of course.
Yeah. And then last question, which I've now said 3 times, but this is a huge fight that I have with my co-host. So because he's not here, I want to get you on the record. Who is the best James Bond, John?
Sean Connery. Come on.
Of course.
Yeah.
My co-host, Alex Dean, who is otherwise a great scholar of humanity, believes, okay, let me ask you this. Who's the worst Bond? Because I bet you that'll be the person that he thinks is the best.
I don't even know the guy's name because it's so bad.
Well, he thinks Roger Moore is the best Bond.
I don't even know who that is. So no.
Yeah, exactly. He's the guy. He's the one from Live and Let Die.
Okay.
So John, tell us, we'll put in the show notes, your books, your institute. Tell us where we can find you. You have a podcast. Talk about your podcast real quick. I just listened to an episode.
Yeah, so my podcast is called the Urban Warfare Project. I have over 70 episodes. I've been doing it for years now, unfortunately, which is just research. You can find it on iTunes or Stitcher or anywhere you get your stuff. You can also go to my website, John Spencer Online, is just where I try to put all my scholarship, books, articles, podcasts, all of it. And then, unfortunately, the Twitter spaces are almost an addiction at this point, but I'm at Spencer Guard on X now.
Yeah, if you follow John and or me on X, and I know a lot of people who are watching this came over from X, so hopefully you enjoy the more lighthearted side of things as well. If you see John and me in any space together, it's pretty likely, not to blow our own horns, but it's pretty likely it's a quality space because we've been in a bunch of them. We know what to avoid. We know what to go into. Not always. There's a few, that
Yeah.
we get sucked into that are don't turn out to be great. But if you follow us, you'll probably be led down the correct path. So John, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. We hope you'll come back and tell more stories from Ukraine, talk about Israel. We'll talk about the laws of war, maybe, if you stop cheating on me with this other guy. And come back anytime. You're always welcome, my friend.
All right. Thanks, Bryan. Happy holidays to you and all your listeners.
Thank you. Cheers, everybody.